We're joined today by Sir Graham Brady, Conservative MP for Altrincham and Sale West since 1997. Just 29 when first elected, he now heads the 1922 committee. This means Sir Graham holds a unique position in government, in that he heads the Tory backbenchers. In the words of the Evening Standard, he is Westminster's most senior Tory who can make or break Prime Ministers. Sir Graham's been something of a thorn in the side of the executive and has been a critic of many aspects of the handling of the pandemic. But how easy has it been to be a dissenting voice in the last 20 months? And perhaps particularly apposite now, when we see the government mired in allegations of sleaze. Has the democratic process itself been damaged or even broken by the last 20 months of the pandemic and a reaction to it? Thanks so much for joining us, Sir Graham. We're very glad to have you here. To begin with, and we'll start with basics perhaps for listeners who aren't aware, could you explain what the 1922 committee is and what your role is as chair of it?
Well, the 1922 committee essentially is all Conservative backbench MPs. So committee is a bit of a misnomer, really. It's more the Parliamentary Conservative Party. But the way the committee developed historically, it started off as just the newly elected Conservative MPs from the 1922 general election. It was a very big intake. They were looking for a chance to get together and try to find out what was going on and how they might be more effective. And before long, in human nature, these people were meeting behind closed doors, and everybody else wanted to know what was going on. So all the other intakes, different generations of Conservative MPs, said, can we come along as well?
Of course.
And the other crucial thing that happened right at the outset was that the members who were setting up the committee didn't want it to be seen as some sort of secret society. So they went to see the then Chief Whip and they said, this is what we're doing, sir, and we thought you should know. And he was a very sensible chap who didn't get carried away with conspiracy theories. He just did sensible, practical politics. And he came up with a rather brilliant idea where he said, well, that's wonderful. Thank you for telling me. Would it help if I sent one of my whips to your meeting every week to tell you what the forthcoming business is going to be? Well, obviously, that meant, of course, that MPs could find out what the business of the House was going to be for the next week. It also meant there was always a party whip sitting in on the meetings. So far from being a secret society, we've always really been part of the plumbing of the Conservative Party in Parliament, the way that the front bench and the back bench communicate. We have an elected executive, Ms. Chairman, the two vice chairmen, two secretaries and a treasurer, and 12 other members of the executive to represent the interests of colleagues. And when it's working at its best, and I think we're in quite a good place on this at the moment, a proper spectrum across the political views of the Conservative Party, across the generations, across the intakes. And that means there's always a sounding board. And when we have our meetings and we're asking what the party thinks, we've got people who represent all strands of opinion and all generations.
Of course. And the backbenchers are usually rather freer to express opinions than the ministers. Is that fair to say? How important are the backbenchers to our parliamentary system? They're perhaps less heralded, but what would you say about
backbenchers make Parliament work. I think the great challenge for backbench MPs, easy enough if you're on the opposition benches because you simply go about opposing the government. But for government backbenchers, there's a choice essentially. You can just devote yourself to trying to climb the greasy pole as quickly as possible, become a member of the government as quickly as you can. But really, it's your fundamental duty and obligation to hold government to account, to scrutinise legislation. And of course, it's a more subtle thing when you're on the government benches. You don't want to be causing problems all of the time for the government, but I think it's at least as important because you're there to raise concerns, perhaps in a more constructive way, but to flag those concerns and hope that problems can be headed off before bad legislation is made or bad decisions are taken.
Of course. And in terms of Parliament itself and the pandemic, of course, every aspect of society, every area has been hit hard by the pandemic, and Parliament was no exception. I believe it was in March when the Speaker stopped all non-essential work in the estate. Many of the hearings were then done remotely. A lot of it has returned, but there's still restrictions or a threat of restrictions. I don't think it's quite back to normal yet. But could you explain what the effects of this was on you as an MP, of you as a head of the backbenchers? Did it frustrate you in any way? Was it harder to hold government to account? What was your day-to-day life like during these restrictions?
Absolutely, it made it harder to hold government to account. It made it harder to do the work of Parliament. And for those who were operating remotely, many working very hard and continuing to do their job very rigorously, but still without the full sort of panoply of opportunities to intervene in debates, to ask ministers questions that arise spontaneously. Some of us took the view that we ought to make sure that Parliament didn't become entirely virtual. So there's a relatively small number of us who just carried on attending in person. And of course, it was adjusted, it was socially distanced, big distancing in the chamber and so on, and none of our staff were allowed in for quite a long period of time. So it was quite a socially distanced environment, but it was possible, I think, to be more effective in holding government to account when actually they're in the chamber with the minister than it is over a Zoom connection, especially when, as we all know, sometimes those Zoom connections
Of course.
don't behave as well as they should. But, I said, carrying on as normally as I could through that period. There were people who from time to time would say, it's very brave of you to carry on doing this. And I said, well, I'm not sure I agree with you, because I'm getting on an almost empty train at Wilmslow and travelling to an empty Euston station and then going to a very big Gothic palace with about 35 people in it. It really didn't feel that frightening. But I think it was important that there was always a physical presence there.
Yeah.
And I think the danger that if we hadn't have been there, things might have gone entirely virtual and might have ended up staying that way for a very long time.
Oh, so was one of the aims of you and your colleagues in going in to ensure that there was always a physical presence there and there wasn't the temptation to say, we can do this indefinitely online?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And did that help with the dissemination of ideas? Did that help with the gauging of opinion and so forth when you were there? Or
Well, I just think, the whole of that kind of representative function became more difficult. It was more difficult for members of Parliament to spend the time we normally spend talking to our constituents, more difficult for people like me with a representative role for Conservative backbenchers to talk to backbenchers as much and hear their views. But certainly it did continue to allow for proper, active engagement in debate and scrutiny in the chamber. Although, I think one of the things that happened with so many people participating remotely, the numbers wanting to speak in debates went up quite a lot.
Oh, really?
And that led to very short time limits being applied to speeches in most of the debates. So I think in some of those really big, important debates on national lockdowns, for instance, we might each have had up to 3 minutes to make our points, which does sometimes mean you've got to be a little bit punchy and maybe a little bit more controversial than you might otherwise be.
Of course. And we're not here to discuss Brexit, which is perhaps fortunate, but I was going to take a risk and quote from the Parliamentary Assembly of Europe, because I think there's a quotation they used in their hearing last year, which could be quite appropriate. The Assembly stressed that, and I quote here, democracy, human rights and rule of law cannot be allowed to become the collateral damage of a pandemic. And that's closing quotes. Do you think that's a sensible warning to make, and do you believe that warning's been heeded? Do you think there's a risk of what they warn has happened?
I think it's a very important warning, and I think from the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, so not an EU body, and one in which we're still participating. But I think that we saw, and I was trying to be reasonable about this at the very outset, when people didn't know just how bad the pandemic was going to be. Was this something which was going to transmit as easily as Ebola? Was it going to be as deadly as Ebola? Or was it something which was going to be closer to being a very serious form of flu? Nobody knew. So I think there was it's reasonable to cut a bit of slack to those who made quite extreme decisions at that point, in case it was much worse than it actually turned out to be. And of course, it turned out to be serious, but not on the scale of an infection like Ebola. So, I think I would differentiate between that first lockdown, when decisions were taken in a very short time scale. The initial intention was for a lockdown that would last for 3 weeks. It was meant to buy a little bit of time for more NHS capacity to be put together. And of course, we saw that great effort to get the Nightingale hospitals put together to provide that capacity. I think the problem was that as time went on, we saw that lockdown moving from being 3 weeks to being 3 months. We saw over a period of about the first 6 months, almost all decisions being taken by government by fiat rather than after debate and votes in the House of Commons. And so, I think we can see those warnings from the Council of Europe are absolutely right. It's nothing new. I think it's always been the case in history that governments, when they have power given to them, are quite likely to want to keep it. It's a natural instinct, I suppose, not to give away those levers of power. It is, however, the duty and the purpose of parliaments in a democracy to stop governments taking and holding on to those powers. We're there to speak up for the public and to defend their liberties. And we're not there just to say, you just carry on and do whatever you think is reasonable. There should be rigorous questioning, rigorous debate, and votes in Parliament. And it was the amendment that I put forward in September last year that sought to bring an end to that. And I thought it was a very instructive experience because in the end, the Speaker's advice from the Clerk of the House was that the amendment wasn't really in order and it couldn't be put to a vote. But the encouraging thing was that the ministers who were responsible for these things at the time, particularly Matt Hancock, but the Leader of the House, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and others, they didn't come to me and say, this is outrageous, why are you asking for this? In the end, we sat down together and they said, look, we agree, you're right. We can't just carry on like this. We need to start governing again through Parliament. But it is a very important reminder that you always need to keep an eye on this, always need to be watchful and make sure that habits don't creep in. And it had become a habit. The government was doing things without consulting Parliament.
I was going to ask you that very question, actually. Do you think that's something which happened or had begun to happen, the idea of a government being unwilling to cede the powers that they'd taken in the emergency situation? And was there something...
and again, I think for the best of reasons that they think, well, what if something takes a turn for the worse? What if something happens suddenly? How can we react as quickly as we need to be able to react? But there is a permanent tension, I think, inherent in democracy that it does make life a bit less convenient for people running governments. And maybe sometimes there is a cost to that. But there's also an enormous cost if parliaments let governments do whatever they like and to hold on to those kind of powers that they'd taken. And some of those powers were extreme. The power to make it illegal for people to see their children or grandchildren, the decision to make it illegal at one point to leave the country, something for which there's literally no public health argument. So really critically important that Parliament should be watching and prepared to flex its muscles at those times.
Do you believe that those kind of measures would have been enacted had there been a full parliamentary scrutiny, or do you think it was simply the panic, in little quotes at the time, the worry at the time that led to those happening?
I think at the beginning there was a mood probably to let the government do more or less whatever it thought was necessary. I hope that if Parliament had been sitting more normally, if we'd been having more debate, then I hope that we would have seen those powers reduced or given up sooner than has happened.
Sure. And just quickly, you have mentioned it earlier, but the other side of the parliamentary coin, the more important one perhaps, or I'm sure you'd say certainly, is the constituents, the voters, the people who put you in power. Recently with Sir David Amess, obviously the tragic case, there's very important questions to be asked about face-to-face meetings. But if I could ask you in more general terms, how important is it that an MP, any MP, has a direct line, a communication channel to their constituents? And was that affected during the pandemic? Has it been harder to gauge your constituents and to pass their concerns back to the government?
I think it's absolutely fundamental. And it's a point that I made when I paid my tribute to David Amess in the House of Commons, that we do in this country, and there are obviously lots of concerns and lots of things that are wrong with our democracy and our system. But we do have probably the most accessible and open Parliament in the world, I would say, and with the most direct connection between elected members and our constituents. And that is something which is very precious. And it works, obviously, because we have our first-past-the-post constituency-based system. It works because most of us are visible and accessible in our constituencies. So people are as likely to chat to us while we're shopping in Sainsbury's as they are to come to a constituency surgery. Well, I think people like that. It matters to them. They feel more connected. Certainly, I've had lots of people saying, we like the fact that we see you walking through town. Doesn't mean that they necessarily want to come up and share their views on something on that occasion, but they know that they could. So we need to make sure that we don't lose that. Obviously, we should behave in a responsible way and try to make sure any sensible security advice is heeded. But I think that must stop short of preventing us from meeting our constituents.
Of course. And did you find it was harder to communicate because of measures during the pandemic, or was it not really affected because of the
I think
methods?
obviously it's harder in that you are less likely to have those casual chance encounters with people. There were far fewer in-person events, and in some periods none whatsoever. So it wasn't possible to go visiting schools or businesses or speaking at local community groups or any of the things that most of us do a lot of the time. So I think that was a limitation. Certainly my constituents are never backwards in coming forwards via the internet or other means of communication. So I think we probably all still had a very steady stream of views and information coming to us. But I think that spontaneous, unplanned sort of interaction is also important.
Sure. And what, by and large, did your constituents say to you? As I said at the beginning, you've been fairly vocal in criticising some of the lockdown measures or the pandemic restriction measures. Have your constituents been broadly in agreement? What have they been saying to you about?
Well, I think you'll find on almost any subject, any constituents who will have a pretty wide range of views. And I'm sure that's true on the pandemic response amongst my constituents. I think some of the things that struck me, there was a particularly strong positive reaction when I was making the point that it's wrong by law to stop people seeing their families. And that's something that I think was causing a lot of people a lot of pain, a lot of psychological pain and suffering, was causing difficulties for families. And these, of course, were decisions that people were perfectly capable of taking for themselves. And I know people in their 80s and 90s who were very happy to just Zoom people, and they thought, no, we'll stay away from people quite a lot. And that's fine, that's their decision. I also know people in their 80s and 90s who said, I'm going to die sometime. I want to die happy, and I'm not going to miss the chance of seeing my grandchildren for the next year or whatever. So I think the idea that people ought to be empowered to make those choices for themselves, not have government imposing them on people, especially at that most fundamental personal level, whether you can see your family or you can start a new relationship with somebody. These are things which government really shouldn't be involved in. So I had a very strong positive reaction for that. I've also had a lot of support when I've raised some of the concerns about restrictions that were, I would say, almost casually imposed, for which there was simply no argument. And it was telling at the end of the first lockdown, or towards the end of the first lockdown, the ban that had been put in place on outdoor sports was lifted, and it was accepted that there was nothing wrong with playing golf or tennis or bowls outdoors. And then as we were heading back into restrictions in the autumn of 2020, the government started to reimpose those. And I stood up and asked the Minister in the Chamber at the House of Commons, why? You've accepted there was no public health reason for the ban in the first place. And the response was quite amazing. It was that the government fully understood that that was a concern, but they decided that if they let people do those things, they might decide that they could do other things as well. Well, I'm afraid this illustrates a really fundamental difference of view about what government is and what the right and proper powers of government should be. And I've always taken the view that government is there to serve the people, not the other way around. So the idea that government would decide without any compelling reason that it would ban people from doing some things which they enjoy and which help to keep them sane, keep them fit and healthy, and for which there was no reason for them to be stopped, seemed to me just utterly incomprehensible. So, I think it depends on the specific issues, but overall, I think I've had a lot of people who are constituents coming to me and saying, yes, we want to make decisions for ourselves, for our own families and our own lives.
And why do you think the government did reach those views, particularly, for example, the sports you mentioned? How do you think that came about, I guess?
I think it was overzealous public health advice. I think the intention being to try to keep people in, not leaving their houses very much at all. And I just think some of it was clearly counterproductive. And when you get consistent advice over the course of the pandemic that being outside is probably safer than being inside, that being fit and healthy is a better place to start if you're unlucky enough to catch COVID than being fat and unhealthy. So you respond to that by banning outdoor sports. Seemed like a very odd position to adopt. But again, these are the things which would benefit from more challenge, more debate, more difficult opportunities where people have got to answer the question, and ministers are made to feel that they're possibly doing something a little bit silly.
I was going to say, if we are in a position where there is overzealous public health advice, I suspect the public would think people to challenge that advice would be the government or the MPs. Do you believe that happened as efficiently as it might have done, or perhaps not?
Well, I think in Parliament, a significant number of us were asking some of those questions. I have to say, mostly they were Conservative members of Parliament who were prepared to do that. A few sort of honourable exceptions on the Labour benches, and eventually the Liberal Democrats decided that maybe there was something called liberalism that they vaguely remembered from the past, and they ought perhaps to start defending some freedoms. But it took a long time to really to get moving and to strike home.
Well, I was going to say, I think you may have covered this already to some degree, but you have been vocal in challenging restrictions. You voted against renewal of the Coronavirus Act. You questioned the advice of some of the sage scientists. What made you reach those conclusions? What made you confident enough to speak up about those particular issues? They're fairly controversial at the time.
Well, the first thing, and the reason I suppose I decided I couldn't hold back, was very locally I saw some very strange decisions being taken. So in the July of 2020, 3 weeks after the first lockdown had ended, my constituents were put in very heavy further restrictions again. That was done at the end of July, beginning of August, at a time when we had steadily falling COVID positive test rates in the area. And whatever it was, 6 weeks later on, as eventually they lifted those additional restrictions, we had rising rates. It was pretty clear there was no real rhyme or reason to it. I think also fairly clear that whatever the effect of restrictions, there certainly wasn't a direct correlation between locking down more and reducing levels of infection. And I've talked to doctors who will say, if you think it through, if you send everybody home where they spend more time in confined spaces together, they might be taking some infection back into an environment where people are going to be living more intimately, closely together. If you tell people that they shouldn't go into the cities, they should all go off and be spread out more in suburbs and in the countryside, then maybe people leave the cities, and perhaps you get some spread of infection through those things. So I just think it was a much more complex pattern, and lockdown seemed to be an extraordinarily blunt tool. And then I saw locally it didn't appear to be working at all. And we got through to that autumn, and we had all of the stuff about tiers being imposed in different parts of the country, and it seemed to be the government was doubling down on it, in that my part of Greater Manchester had lower rates of COVID than neighbouring areas, East Cheshire, Warrington, which had higher levels of COVID, and we were put into a higher tier of restrictions than they were. So, I think it seemed very difficult to justify, and especially in an area like mine, we're at the edge of the Greater Manchester conurbation. When we went into those restrictions in the autumn of 2020, or maybe I'm thinking of the summer ones, when it wasn't possible to go to a pub in Altrincham, but it was possible to walk a short distance across the county boundary into East Cheshire and go to a pub there, which were doing very good business, I might add, as a result of it. So the thing that got me particularly vocal was seeing the local effects and the unfair application of restrictions.
And did you then look further into this? Did you have expert opinion you spoke to, or was it mainly from constituents?
Well, I'm also very fortunate. I've got a lot of constituents who are experts. So I've tried to keep talking to constituents who are senior clinicians and scientists. Also, obviously, talking to people who are trying to run businesses, looking at things like the very successful hospitality offer in Altrincham, which has been the means by which the town regenerated in recent years, and where, as across the country, huge efforts have been made at an enormous expense to make sure that hospitality environments were safe. We then had Sage publishing a paper in September of 2020 in which it said the evidence for what they call non-pharmaceutical interventions like closing pubs was weak. It was then done. So based on weak evidence, after people had done everything they'd been asked to do to make environments safer, there was then a further extreme reaction of ordering them to close. And obviously quite a lot of people, especially if their livelihoods depended on it, got quite irate about that.
Why, this may be a tricky one to answer, but why do you think that was, given the evidence that was available? Why do you think they doubled down on it and carried on with the...
It's very difficult for me to answer. I can only think that there was a culture of caution, which would always put any effort to reduce the spread of COVID ahead of any of the other things that needed balancing with it, whether it be people's right to earn a living, whether it be people's right to socialise, whether it be their right to see their families. It was always put second to taking whatever step might possibly help to reduce the spread of COVID. And it didn't have to be something that had strong evidence behind it. It could be something like the closure of pubs and restaurants, where the scientists were saying there's only weak evidence.
Well, in those circumstances, with the evidence you've just outlined and the experience of your constituents, why do you believe you've remained in a minority? Why do you believe there's not more MPs speaking out on this, not more MPs prepared to vote against these rules?
I think public opinion has shifted significantly over the last several months. Members of Parliament are quite responsive to what they're hearing from constituents, but I think that it was a difficult thing to do. I think it was always the possibility that one would vote against a restriction and there'd be a sudden increase in infections or hospitalisations, and people would get more worried about it again. And it was difficult, I think, to say, well, hang on, let's only do things if there's really compelling evidence for it. And I think they're difficult judgments. As I said, I reached my judgment largely because I'd seen very clear local evidence where restrictions were being introduced and they weren't having any effect, or they appeared to. I'm not saying they caused things to get worse, but they certainly we saw things getting worse the tighter the restrictions were at one point.
And did you see colleagues who'd reached the same conclusions as you? Did you find that they'd reach them independently? Did you find each person had a different reason for taking the stance they did, or was it something that you collectively got together and said, we'll do something about this? How did
I think
that
it's
come about?
obviously a combination of those things. I think on reflection, I'd also say that these sort of changes of mood and opinion happen more readily when members of Parliament are meeting together. And I think probably the decision to push most members of Parliament back out into the country and keep them away from Westminster made it less likely that we were going to have those discussions, that sharing of evidence, the bit of sparring that might move opinion on more rapidly.
So you might convince a colleague who might convince a colleague if you're able to speak together. I suppose it's a vicious circle in a way, that when perhaps scrutiny is most needed, the MPs are most dispersed around the country.
I think that's precisely right, and I think it may well be one of the reasons why lockdowns carried on for longer than they should.
Really, yeah. And back to Parliament, you mentioned the Lib Dems, you mentioned some colleagues in the backbenchers of the Tory party. Labour, the opposition, are you surprised that they haven't opposed perhaps more? Do you think?
I think it's deeply regrettable. There were things like, I think back to one of the first votes that we did have on the restrictions, which was the vote on the 10 o'clock curfew. And, there were opportunities to make a difference then. It particularly pained me, though, at the time, I think it was in January this year, the renewal of the Coronavirus Act. And I think it's fine if that's the view of the opposition, that they think the government's doing the right thing and they support those powers remaining. I disagreed with them, but that's perfectly reasonable for them to make that judgment. What I thought was a very obvious failure of opposition was to allow the renewal for a full 6-month period. And it was entirely possible at that point, if the opposition had come to the government and said, look, we're supporting you, we're not taking away any of the levers that you might possibly need to do what you think you need to do, but it's our job, it's our duty to watch you like hawks, and so we're not going to give you a renewal for 6 months. We want the legislation changed so it needs renewing every 2 weeks or every month. And I thought it was astonishing that the official opposition failed to do that. It would have given more opportunity for scrutiny. It would have just kept the government a bit more on its mettle. And I think one of the things that people need to remember is that parliamentary challenge is there to improve the process of government. It's not just about negativity. It's not just about picking holes in things. By requiring ministers to defend their choices and their actions, you make it more likely they're going to make rational choices and do the right thing.
I think we have seen more criticism of MPs and ministers in recent months since Parliament has been sitting. Certainly in the media, there's more. I mean, perhaps the sketch writers aren't the best example, but PMQs is often covered. Who's performed well is often covered, and I think perhaps there is a degree of holding people up to scrutiny there in the press. I think from our point of view that has helped. But interesting, we've heard from previous guests that challenging the orthodoxy can be risky. We've heard of people being smeared, of people being silenced. We've had people claiming their jobs have been put under threat from speaking out. Have you heard of these things happening yourself? And also, have you had any consequences yourself personally from taking the position you've taken?
I have heard of them happening, and certainly I'm aware of some serious academics who have been put under quite unpleasant pressure or criticism. I've met very senior clinicians of all disciplines who, one I was in touch with recently, I met at an event to do with a particular disease, and he was very concerned about the way in which, the extent to which the focus of NHS activity was shifted too much to dealing just with COVID and the number of other things that have been neglected. But it was very telling. In quite a long email that this doctor sent me following up, he made some points, but said, I've had to be very careful about what I've said in public because, I work for an NHS trust and I know of people who've been warned not to say things. And I think that that is a worry. We need an open culture where people can express concerns, can raise other ideas and challenge things. And it's very dangerous if you only have one set of ideas that governs everything. Personally, I've only had I won't claim I've had any difficulties for me, and in a sense, nobody can take my job away apart from my constituents, which maybe is an easier position to be in. But what I have experienced is that as somebody who's always quite vocally supported the vaccination program, I think it was the standout success of what the government's done over the last 20 months or so. I then have had some people seeking to suggest that I am opposed to vaccination. And it's as though this is a way that they can suggest that somebody's got a kind of anti-scientific viewpoint. Have raised concerns about vaccination for children, in that I think these should be decisions that are made by parents, and I think that the decisions should be based on the welfare of the child themselves rather than the potential welfare for the wider population. And I do think that people should be able to make these choices personally, and I voted particularly on grounds of religious conscience against the requirement for people working in care homes to be vaccinated, because I've got a Christian Science care home in my constituency, but I've got a number of other care homes that are struggling now and worried they're going to lose staff they desperately need and won't be able to do their jobs as well. So I've raised some of those concerns, and when the response is to say that you're doing it for a reason other than the reason you're doing it, I think there's something a little bit worrying there.
And I suppose it's very hard to say, but where do you think these anti-vax claims, these COVID denier claims come from? Where do you feel it's something orchestrated, or is it simply as someone who disagrees with your argument, it's the simplest thing to go for?
I find it difficult to think that it would be orchestrated in any way, but I think there has been the most extraordinary groupthink on all of this, and there seems to be an element of the public health establishment and some supporters of it in the media who are completely victim to that groupthink and don't think it's right for people to ask questions. And that, I think, is a very, very worrying place to arrive at.
Is there something that could be done to stop that? Any kind of protection that could be given to these academics that could be done through parliamentary processes?
I don't know about parliamentary process. Certainly universities should be making it explicit that people can speak out. I would like to see the Department of Health and the National Health Service, National Health England and the others making it clear that if people want to raise concerns, they won't be penalised for it. And of course, in other instances, we champion and protect whistleblowers. I'd quite like to think that if a doctor's concerned that something might have some dangers, whether it be thinking of the great work that Professor Carol Sikora has done in calling attention over the last 18 months and more to the number of people who are not getting diagnosis for cancer or not getting the treatment for cancer that they needed. And there are many other examples. I think that we ought to be thanking those people for raising their concerns rather than keeping quiet.
So would you welcome some kind of promise or pledge from the NHS that we will allow people to speak out, to give their views without fear of sanction, or is that too much to ask for at the moment?
I don't know whether it's too much to ask for. I think it ought to be encouraged, and we are all in a better place if people can speak out and debate and raise concerns and suggest other approaches.
And these worries that have happened to others, they won't stop you from speaking out, presumably, or perhaps they will.
No, I think it's incumbent on us all to speak out and to ask questions. We will, of course, as we're coming through and moving away from a pandemic into an endemic illness, we will be seeing at least one public inquiry, and really important that some of the questions are put from every side of the argument. And very important, for instance, that now with the whole sort of timeline going back to the beginning of the pandemic, people can look at what the performance on COVID in Sweden has been, or in Florida, where they avoided full lockdowns and they avoided mask mandates, and they did have some restrictions, but they broadly allowed people to continue living more normal lives, and they have a better performance than most of the countries that went for hard lockdowns have got. These are things that it's vital that we examine them, because they will inform any future response to a future pandemic.
So when the inquiry comes, you believe it ought to look at it in the whole, not just be a case of how could we have limited COVID deaths. It should also be, were the measures we put in place the appropriate ones? Were they correct ones, perhaps? I suppose,
yes, I think it should look at both the question of what was acceptable for government to do, were the things which should never be contemplated, and I think those legal restrictions on family interaction would, in my view, fall into that box. But we also need to look very carefully at the relative performance against COVID under different regimes. And if you do that and look at the fact, people often say, but Sweden, it's not got very many people. Actually, Sweden, if you look at it, analyse it properly, it's a slightly more urban society than the United Kingdom is, because most people live in a very small number of large cities. So it's a very valid comparison and test case. Similarly, there are different approaches were taken in different US states, which give some comparators. And I don't think anybody is really in a position yet to say emphatically what works and what doesn't work. But certainly it's possible to look at very different approaches taken in very similar places. I know North and South Dakota are often quoted in this way, and see that the performance over time was often better in the places that had lower levels of restriction. And it may be, I've heard it said that in every other pandemic that humanity has ever faced, the approach was to try to control the movement of people who are known to be infected. And this is the first time that governments around the world tried to control the movement of everybody who wasn't infected. Well, maybe that wasn't the right thing to do.
It was something that you've mentioned Sweden and a couple of US states. I think it would be reasonable to say it was something that most Western democracies did do, perhaps one after the other. And again, what do you think there's lessons there? You mentioned groupthink earlier. Do you think there was an international groupthink? It was a pandemic. It was a worldwide crisis. Did people learn from and copy each other?
Well, they certainly copied. Whether they were learning, I don't know. And I think one of the most remarkable things that came out was, of course, the reports of discussions in SAGE, where in the early days they said we looked at what they were doing in China and said, well, if only we could do that, but there's no way the British people would ever put up with it. And then we were so astonished to find how much they had put up with it. So, I think there maybe had been a belief in some quarters that our habits of liberal democracy and our attachment to freedom were more deeply entrenched than perhaps they appeared to be in March 2020.
And could that have been something which led to the more draconian orders? If you're thinking perhaps that in a liberal democracy where people value their freedoms, not everyone's going to adhere to this, so we better make it fairly stringent just in case people don't.
I don't know. I think the evidence would be that actually people adhered to the restrictions far more than anybody expected.
In the end, certainly, yeah.
I would say that there was somebody near to where my flat is in London. Somebody had taken to chalking on walls, no TV, no panic. And I think maybe there's an element of wisdom in that. There was a very deliberate communications campaign, partly funded by government, which was intended to make people more concerned all of the time. And it was hugely effective.
Was it ethical?
I worry a great deal about government in a democracy seeking to use, not political parties, but government using the government machine to mould people's attitudes and responses. But it seems to me that that is reaching a point where the views of the public are deliberately being manipulated to reach a particular position of support for the government's chosen policy agenda.
And you believe that happened to some degree during this pandemic?
I think it's the inevitable conclusion.
And that's presumably the spy-bee, the fear messages, the people aren't sufficiently worried.
Yes,
that kind of.
It was all
attitude.
said. I mean, to be fair, it was all said openly. If you read the minutes of these organisations, maybe that's one of the things we should still congratulate ourselves for: a degree of openness that says you could read the minutes and see that these things were quite deliberately being done.
Yeah. And if I just take you back slightly to the man at the top, you presumably have a fair degree, perhaps a lot of contact with the Prime Minister. What's Boris Johnson like to work with? What's he been like to work with through this?
I'd say during the more intense period of the pandemic, again, there was no personal contact. It was possible to speak on the telephone or by Zoom or whatever. Again, I find that Zoom meetings and similar or WhatsApp exchanges are less effective, less rewarding than personal interaction. So I think quite a lot of that stuff went on hold for a period. I do see the Prime Minister reasonably regularly, and we can have quite good open discussions. I've worked with 3 different Prime Ministers in my capacity as chairman of the 1922 committee. You couldn't have 3 more different people, completely different styles. But certainly I've found a preparedness to listen. I'd never found, even at times when I was perhaps one of the most vocal critics of policy positions that the government was taking, I never found that I was being treated as though I was being irritating, or I don't think the Prime Minister was ever angry with me. I think an openness to be challenged and to have a proper debate.
So he never tried to rein you in directly, as far as you could see. No. Okay. And what would you say? This is again probably a little too wide-ranging, but what would you say are the main things Boris has got right and wrong in the pandemic?
Well, as I said earlier, I think the vaccine programme was the standout success. It was done quickly and efficiently. There had been the early decision to set up the task force to get the vaccines and then to order them in large volumes. That, I think, is clearly the great success. Most of the other elements of response I have had concerns about, and whether it be the things which should never be done, telling people they can't see their families, whether it be the restrictions that go on for too long or are introduced again for no good reason, like banning football and golf and tennis, whether it be things that serve no purpose, like preventing people from leaving the country. They all, I think, were completely wrong. When the government started to come back to a more normal conservative position, certainly, or liberal position, of seeking to trust people more to make their own decisions, I'm fully behind that. And I think the proper role of government in seeking to ensure that people have got the best advice and information available to them to make those decisions, that people have access to both vaccines and also the various treatments that can help to reduce the effect of COVID illness. Those are all part of the proper role of government. Setting out in detail what people can and can't do is not.
And of course, in June, well, it ended up being July, but we had Freedom Day. When it did happen in July, there was a large body of doctors who, I think it was 1,200, who suggested this was very reckless. It was going to cause enormous numbers of deaths. And the government went ahead with it anyway. This presumably was something you welcomed, a decision
Absolutely.
to... Yeah.
And we have seen, obviously, we saw a continuing fall in infections as the opening up took place. And, again, as I've said, I would never be bold enough to say that different restrictions will have no effect. But I think it was very clear lifting those restrictions didn't have an adverse effect. Similarly, when children went back to school in September, it went largely without a problem. And now we're at a point where we've had steady falls in positive test rates over recent weeks. Everything moving in a very encouraging direction, which obviously we all hope continues.
And those falls came actually after another raft of warnings, I believe, from I think it was the NHS Confederation and so on, who suggested a move to Plan B was needed now.
Quite.
And within 8 days, I believe the cases were falling. So perhaps
and
this
thankfully
is
the Prime Minister is resisting and has resisted the calls for so-called Plan B. And on current trends and movements, I don't see any likelihood of that position changing.
And to keep with the Prime Minister, actually, obviously trust is vital in any administration, particularly for a PM. And I think we've recently seen that trust eroded a little with the Owen Paterson issue. And it's been portrayed as a circling of the wagons of the Tories to protect one of their own. I think it's fair to ask, given we've looked at how the public has been asked to monitor their lives, to hold it under the spotlight during the pandemic, shouldn't MPs expect the same? And is it not right that people are a little bit perplexed by what happened in the Paterson affair?
Yes, and I think the government has rightly admitted that it was a mistake to join together two different things. One being an entirely proper and rational desire to have a fairer system, which is something that governments of both colours have neglected to do for a very long time, and the other being the case of Owen Paterson, which is difficult for a lot of us. He was my intake. There are a very small group of us now in Parliament, and of course he'd been through a terrible experience in believing that the investigation led directly to his wife's suicide. So I think that there was certainly a very strong sympathy for Owen, which was not to say that he didn't do anything wrong, but there was very considerable sympathy for him as a human being. I think it's very important to remember the motion that was passed and then abandoned very rapidly. The motion that was passed did not exonerate Owen Paterson. What it did was say that we should set up a new system that respected the rules of natural justice, and in all probability it would have heard the case again. And it's entirely possible, you might say likely, it would have come to the same conclusion based on the same rules. But we go back all the way to 2003, I think the Wicks report, which looked at how the system of regulation should be improved, said there should be a proper judicially led appeal process, independent appeal process. It's still not there. And it said the role of the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards was too broad, that the one individual acts as investigator, prosecutor and judge, and that can't be right. So, in many ways, there's a personal situation, but also there is a great weight of culpability, I would say successive governments over the last 20 years, which have failed to look at those recommendations and do something about making sure the system of regulation of Parliament provides proper natural justice.
You yourself voted for a legislative amendment, which would have been the amendment which was then you turned on. Do you regret it, or would you still do it?
I think I regret the whole thing, but I think it should certainly have been separated. I think an attempt to set up something to improve the process, to provide due process and fairness, is clearly the right thing to do. My own preference, and the thing that I put forward in advance, which wasn't taken up, was that instead of being a select committee with a chair drawn from the Conservative Party, that asking the Speaker to set up a Speakers' Commission or a Speakers' Conference to look at all these things would have been a better way of doing it, and it would have been more evidently non-partisan. And I think in terms of the optics of it, as you put it, the appearance of the Conservative Party circling the wagons, I think it might have avoided a lot of that.
I was just going to, I'm sure you've read these many times, but obviously Sir John Major a blistering attack this weekend suggested the behaviour as a whole could be seen as politically corrupt. Keir Starmer says Mr Johnson's damaged himself, damaged his party and damaged our democracy. Do you think that's fair?
I think all of these things should be taken very, very seriously. I think what concerns me in those remarks is the danger that they suggest that there is a more profound problem with British politics than really exists. And I think we should pinch ourselves and remind ourselves that whatever the flaws and whatever the silly mistakes that might have been made recently, we don't really have political corruption in this country in the way that it's endemic in many other countries. And it always seems to me actually the kind of corruption that really exists in British politics comes from the fact that we don't have a separation of powers between the executive and the legislature, which takes us right back to where we started our conversation. And the danger that members of Parliament will see their whole objective as being working to support an executive, working to become part of an executive, and will lose their independence. And it always seems to me very strange that in the United Kingdom, if you ask the public what they would like, they quite like members of Parliament to be independently minded, they like them to speak up for their local communities. Actually, what we reward in Parliament is supporting the government if you're a member of the governing party, and the reward becomes the possibility of joining the government in due course.
I suppose that makes it particularly difficult as well, that you're particularly beholden to the whip, because if you break it, you're fired, or your chances of advancement stop. Is that something you think ought to be changed?
Well, I mean, I've spoken many times about the attraction of a greater separation of powers between the executive and the legislature. I think it's a very big constitutional change, and I don't see it happening anytime soon. But certainly, it would be a mistake to do things which reduce the independence of backbench members of Parliament and which move them further away from what our constituents would like to see.
And on the power of backbench MPs, it's often said the MP that the PM is most scared of is the 1922 head, a Tory MP. And one of the reasons for this is the ability to trigger a leadership contest. I believe it's 15% of the MPs have to write to you suggesting they want one. I think I make that 54, 55 now would need to write to you at the moment. You then keep the letters and inform the leader when it passes a certain number. I realise this is something you're not likely to discuss, but on the question of the letters, would you be willing to say if you have any? Have you had any?
No, and the reason that I will never say that, and obviously I've been chairman of the 1922 committee for 11 years now, is that if one says yes, I've had a letter, then it's possible people say, well, have you got more letters? Have you, has a letter been withdrawn? And the next time say, no, I haven't got any letters. The only sensible thing for a chairman of the 1922 committee to do is not to comment on that subject. And it's said years ago, even my wife doesn't know how many letters I had at that time. And I think it's very important as an entirely neutral process. So in a way, I would say Conservative Prime Ministers don't have to be frightened of the chairman of the 1922 committee, but it's right that they should be concerned about the views of backbench MPs. The chairman of the 22 is the vehicle through which Conservative members of Parliament can articulate concerns about the leadership.
And just back to a general overview, back to what we were touching on earlier. You've been in Parliament for 21 years now.
24.
24 years now. That's my maths. You sat through Tory Labour administrations, as you say, 3 Tory MPs, two Labour ones. It's been tested like never before, perhaps, in the last 20 months. Do you think it's proved robust enough to deal with the challenges of something like the coronavirus pandemic, or has it been found wanting?
I think that Parliament was too willing to take instruction. And I think that, even thinking right back at the beginning, both houses of Parliament seemed, very happy to go off on recess for quite a long Easter break. I think you said earlier, at exactly the time that scrutiny was more important than ever. But I think that coming back after that recess was important, whether those of us who did it in person or those who were doing it virtually. What concerns me, I think I said earlier, what concerns me is the extent to which members of the public very often conflate Parliament and government and don't realise the extent to which the two are separate. And I think there's a danger that members of Parliament start to do the same. And we really need to continue to recognise there is a separate and difficult role for members of Parliament, and that they aren't simply there to act as creatures of their own party. Well, I think we're all conscious we're elected very largely because of the party label on which we stand, but we're also elected in part because, especially those of us who've been around for a while, our constituents know what we stand for, and they know sometimes what the points of difference are between us as individuals and the party centrally. So I think as a country we will benefit if we recognise the importance of Parliament as opposed to the executive.
And what would you say the dangers were if Parliament weren't able to make its voice heard, if it was a more... there's been a lot of claims that the government's behaved in a fairly autocratic way. Totalitarian has been named. I'm sure that's not one you'd agree with. But what are the dangers if we don't learn the lessons from perhaps a lack of scrutiny, perhaps a lack of trust in Parliament moving forward? Do you think the damage could be long-lasting?
Well, I hope some of those lessons have been learned, and I think if we were to face a similar challenge in the future, certainly while those of us who are here this time are still around, I hope there would be a greater confidence about speaking out sooner and asking the difficult questions. But I'm always conscious, years ago when I was on the Treasury Select Committee at the time of the banking crisis, and we had the then Governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, come to give evidence, and the chairman of the committee said, "Governor, what we really want to hear from you is what we need to do to make sure that the problems that have just happened will never happen again." And Mervyn King, I thought, gave a brilliant answer. And he said, there's nothing you can do to make sure this will never happen again. It will probably happen again as soon as there is nobody still in any position of responsibility who remembered what happened this time. And I guess learning the lesson of how important that kind of collective memory and experience is would be a greater safeguard than almost anything else. We, I think, have perhaps not enough length of experience in government, in Parliament, and it remains important, as does youthful vigour. I say as a greybeard who started off when I was only 29.
Of course. And my last question would be, are you confident going forward? Do you think the lessons will be learned? Do you think if we did have, do you think we will, A, come out of this pandemic in some way intact, and B, were a future pandemic to hit, do you think we'd be better prepared to deal with it?
I hope we would. We've certainly got experience to tell us how better to deal with a pandemic. I think that in many ways we are coming through in better shape than might have been expected. Certainly economic growth has been quite strong and employment remains high, and some of those things that were worrying possibilities from shutting down so much of the economy. And I think credit has to be given to the government and to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, perhaps especially, for some of those measures, the furlough scheme, the support for businesses, which were put in place. And they really, I think, have paid off in terms of businesses surviving and people remaining in employment. So I think, yes, I'm optimistic. I think we have got challenges, the huge amounts of spending and debt that were incurred as a result of the pandemic response will have consequences, and we need to work with that and make sure that we don't allow ourselves to become an uncompetitive economy that will see declining living standards in future years. But we also need to remember those lessons about the importance of our liberties and our freedoms, about putting our children, young people first, not allowing them to take the hit whilst we take steps to protect ourselves. So I do hope that when we have that inquiry or inquiries, all of those elements will be in the mix, and that they will help us when we face a future challenge to ask the right questions, to make sure that people are striking the right balance, making sure that cancer gets treated as well as COVID, making sure that children get schooled and they don't fall behind, making sure that young people can still form relationships, or indeed old people can form relationships, making sure that people can see their families and make those judgments for themselves. I really hope that that's a lesson that's been learned.
So, Graham, thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful speaking to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.